Okay, gamer girls, listen up. If you're a gamer girl, then this is your year. If you played Love Nikki as a kid, well, we've got news for you. For those who may not know, Love Nikki is an adorable role-playing dress-up game featuring high-quality graphics and a rich, captivating story. Now, Paper Games has just released a 3D animated movie trailer. It's called Nikki and the God of Dreams. I mean, just look at it, it's beautiful. But Love Nikki fans know this is more than just a dress-up game. The trailer description reads, "Do you remember the most wonderful dream you've ever had? Come with Nikki to a magical dream world." Now we can't wait to see the story behind it. The animation looks a little different from the game, but it's still just amazing to watch. But wait, there's more. A debut trailer just dropped for Infinity Nikki, featuring gorgeous gameplay on the PS4 and PS5. This open world game looks amazing. And the characters' dress designs? Stunning. This is the first dress-up game that became open world. Just think of the possibilities. Love Nikki is a game that is dear to so many hearts, and we are so excited to see this franchise bloom and finally get the recognition it deserves. So, what do you think? Will you check out Love Nikki and the God of Dreams? Or are you excited for Infinity Nikki? Let us know in the comments below.